On July 25, 2025, a grandmother stood in a Phoenix courtroom, looked across the room at the woman who had killed her 7-year-old grandson, and read a letter written in his voice. The letter said, "I should be 13 years old now, but I am forever 7. She could not finish it calmly. She directed the final line across that courtroom with everything she had left inside her. "I trusted you." Then she broke down completely. The woman she was speaking to did not flinch, did not look away, did not say a word. She sat in her orange jail uniform, composed, almost still, as a grandfather screamed at her through a remote link demanding to know if she had enjoyed it, as a grown man's voice. Shatter describing the bullet that had passed within inches of ending his life, as her own surviving son looked into a camera and said 11 words that silenced the entire room. I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy. And when it was finally her turn to speak, after all of that, after every voice in that room had spent itself trying to reach her, she stood up and told the court that a divine force was assembling people inside prison systems to be released for a higher purpose, and that she was one of them. What happened next is why this story is unlike anything else in recent American criminal history, because the judge who sentenced her did not simply hand down a punishment. He looked directly at her, on the official record, in open court, and told her something that no prison wall and no length of sentence and no legal ruling could ever replicate. Something aimed with surgical precision at the one thing she had spent her entire life protecting. And when you hear what he said, you will understand exactly why some legal observers argue that what Lori Vallow Daybell is living inside right now is actually worse than the death sentence her husband is facing on death row. Stay with this, because this story goes to places the news cycle never reached. If you are new here, this is Crimes Records, where we go deeper than the headlines. Subscribe now and stay with this, because what you are about to hear goes far beyond anything the news cycle covered. There is a man sitting on death row right now in Idaho. His name is Chad Daybell. He knows what is coming. Not the exact date, not the exact hour, but the state of Idaho has looked at what he did, weighed it, named it, and set a process in motion with a defined conclusion at the end. The legal machinery is already running. The sequence is moving. There is a point on a timeline the state is actively working toward, and that point has his name on it. Lori Vallow Daybell does not have that. She is currently confined at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in southeastern Idaho, one of approximately 355 women inside that facility. 7 life sentences across 2 states. No parole mechanism attached to any of them. No review date. No board she can petition. No hearing scheduled anywhere on the calendar of her future. The legal structure built around her does not point toward a conclusion. It points toward nothing. It simply continues. And it will continue day after day, count after count, work rotation after work rotation, until the day she passes away inside that facility and the schedule simply keeps running without her. That distinction between a sentence with a named ending and a sentence that simply does not end is what this entire story is built around. Because when you understand who Lori Vallow Daybell believed herself to be, when you understand the framework she constructed around her own identity, around her own significance, around her own place at the center of everything, you begin to understand why a judge in Maricopa County decided that the most devastating thing he could say to her was not a number of years. It was a quiet, documented, utterly certain prediction about her future. But before we get to that courtroom, before we get to that sentence, we have to go back to the beginning. Because nothing about what happened in 2019 and beyond makes sense without understanding what was being built in the years before it. And nothing about where Lori Vallow Daybell is now makes sense without understanding the full weight of what it cost to get there. Lori Noreen Cox was born on June 2006, 1973, in San Bernardino, California. She grew up in a religious household and carried that faith with her into adulthood. People who knew her in the years before any of this describe her in consistent terms: charismatic, warm, magnetic, someone who filled rooms with energy and conviction and drew people toward her without apparent effort. She was married 5 times across her adult life, and by the time the events of 2019 began to unfold, she was living in Arizona with her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, and her 2 youngest children. Charles Vallow was 62 years old when he died. He had adopted JJ, Lori's young son, and by most accounts had built a life with her that, from the outside, looked ordinary. But something had shifted inside that household in the year or two before his death. Charles had filed for divorce. He had told family members he was afraid. He had taken out a life insurance policy worth $1 million, with Lori as the beneficiary. He had begun documenting things, conversations, behaviors, changes in Lori that he did not know how to explain but knew he needed to record. On July 11, 2019, Charles Vallow was shot and killed inside the home of Lori's brother, Alexander Cox, in Chandler, Arizona. Alexander Cox told police he had acted in self-defense, that Charles had come at him with a baseball bat. No charges were filed against Cox at the time. Lori collected the life insurance. Charles Vallow was buried, and the path ahead of Lori Vallow, the path toward Chad Daybell and toward everything that followed, became significantly clearer. Alexander Cox died in December 2019, a pulmonary embolism, before investigators had the opportunity to build a full case against him. He was never charged with anything connected to Charles Vallow's death. That question, like so many others in this case, closed before it could be fully answered. 3 months before Charles Vallow was killed, Lori had been deepening a relationship with a man named Chad Daybell. Chad was a self-published author of apocalyptic fiction who had built a modest following within fringe segments of the Latter-day Saint community. He wrote about end times, about the Second Coming, about spiritual warfare and the unseen forces he believed were shaping the world. And when he and Lori found each other, they built something together that went far beyond theological interest. What they constructed was a belief system with themselves at its center, not peripheral players in a divine story, but the central figures, translated beings in their own language, people of cosmic significance whose choices carried sacred weight. People for whom the ordinary rules that governed other lives did not fully apply because they were operating on a different plane of purpose entirely. Within that framework, the people around them were assigned roles. Some were designated as light, others were designated as dark, meaning they were believed to have been spiritually overtaken, possessed by something that had replaced who they once were. The private term Lori and Chad used for those they considered spiritually compromised was zombie. And once a person had been assigned that designation inside their framework, the implications were severe. Prosecutors argued at trial that this belief system was not peripheral decoration to the crimes that followed. It was the operating architecture. It was the theological justification that allowed two people to look at children, at a spouse, at a former partner, and make decisions that no ordinary moral framework could accommodate. J.J. Vallow, 7 years old, had been designated as dark. Tylee Ryan, 16 years old, had been designated as dark. Charles Vallow had been designated as an obstacle. Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife of nearly 30 years, stood between Chad and his destiny with Lori. Within that system, removing them was not cruelty. Within that system, it was purpose. Tylee Ryan was born on July 24, 2002. She was Lori's daughter from her marriage to Joseph Ryan, and the people who knew her describe a teenager with creativity and warmth and a whole life stretched out ahead of her. She was last confirmed alive on September 8, 2019. Photographs and video footage taken that day show her at Yellowstone National Park with Lori, with JJ, and with Lori's nephew, Zach Cox. She is visible in those images. She is present. And after that day, she was never seen again. J.J. Vallow was born on May 2005, 2012. He was 7 years old when he disappeared. He had been diagnosed with autism and required the kind of consistent daily care and stable routine that a young child with his needs depended on entirely. The people who loved him, and there were many, describe a child who was joyful and affectionate, and deeply connected to the grandparents who would later stand in a Phoenix courtroom and fight through their grief to say his name out loud. JJ was last seen alive in September 2019. After that, he simply vanished from any verifiable record. In October 2019, while both children were already gone, something else happened in Arizona. Brandon Boudreaux was the ex-husband of Lori's niece, Melanie Boudreaux. On October 2, 2019, someone drove up to Brandon's home in Gilbert, Arizona, and fired a weapon through his vehicle window. The bullet passed within inches of ending his life. Brandon survived. Investigators connected the vehicle used in the attempt to Zach Cox, Lori's nephew. Prosecutors would later argue that Lori had arranged the attempt, that Brandon represented a threat to Melanie's ability to fully commit to the inner circle that Lori and Chad were building around themselves. On October 19, 2019, Tammy Daybell died at the home she shared with Chad in Salem, Idaho. Her death was attributed to natural causes. She was buried. 2 weeks later, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were married in Hawaii. The speed of that marriage, measured against the timeline of Tammy's death, was something that people around them noticed immediately. What investigators would eventually discover when they looked more closely was something far more consequential. Tammy Daybell's body was exhumed. Forensic analysis found evidence consistent with asphyxiation. She had not died of natural causes. She had been killed. In November 2019, family members, including JJ's grandparents Larry and Kay Woodcock, began alerting authorities that the children were missing. Welfare checks were conducted. Lori refused to produce them. She told police JJ was with a family friend. She offered no credible explanation for Tylee's absence. And then, with Chad, she fled to Hawaii. The months that followed were a strange and painful public chapter in this case. There were press conferences. There were social media posts. There were jailhouse interviews that Lori gave after her eventual arrest in February 2020 on charges of desertion connected to the children. In those interviews and public appearances, she presented herself as a wronged woman, a mother being persecuted, a person of faith surrounded by forces that did not understand her. She was poised. She was composed. She sought cameras and she found them, and she used every one. The children were still missing. On June 9, 2020, investigators searching the rural Idaho property belonging to Chad Daybell found what they were looking for, and what they found was devastating. The remains of JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan were discovered buried in separate locations on the property. JJ had been strangled. Tylee's remains showed evidence of dismemberment and burning, a deliberate and sustained effort to destroy physical evidence of how she had died. Both children had been hidden in the ground on property belonging to the man their mother had married 2 weeks after his wife's death. Lori had continued collecting Social Security benefits in JJ's name for months after his death. Money designated for a child she knew was buried in the ground. Month after month, the checks came, and the money was collected, and the child was gone, and she said nothing. Chad Daybell was arrested the day the remains were found. Lori had already been in custody since her February arrest in Hawaii. And from that point forward, the legal machinery that would eventually build 7 life sentences around Lori Vallow Daybell began its slow, methodical, irreversible operation. The first trial belonged to Lori. In Ada County, Idaho, beginning in April 2023, she faced a jury on 6 counts, 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder covering JJ, Tylee, and Tammy Daybell, and 1 count of grand theft for continuing to collect Social Security benefits in JJ's name after his death. The trial lasted approximately 6 weeks. The jury heard forensic testimony, text messages, witness accounts, and the full documented record of what had been buried on that Idaho property and what the evidence connected to Lori Vallow Daybell. On May 12, 2023, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on every single count. Not one charge survived the deliberation. Every count, every victim, every element of what prosecutors had laid before the jury came back as a guilty finding. Sentencing came on July 31, 2023. Judge Stephen Boyce had presided over the entire trial. He had heard every argument, weighed every piece of evidence, and watched Lori Vallow Daybell move through his courtroom for weeks. When the moment came to address her directly, he did not reach for careful language. He looked at her and said she had chosen the most evil and destructive path possible. Then he handed down the sentence. 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus a fixed 10-year sentence for the grand theft conviction. 3 of the life sentences were structured to run consecutively, one after the other. The murder of JJ, the murder of Tylee, the conspiracy to bring about the death of Tammy Daybell. One sentence concludes, and the next begins, and then the next after that. 2 additional life sentences run concurrently. The courts use one word for sentences constructed this way: fixed. They do not move. They do not adjust. They do not bend toward any future date. They simply exist, and they continue to exist, until the person inside them does not. But Idaho was not the end. In November 2023, she was transferred to Arizona, where two separate cases were waiting for her: the death of Charles Vallow and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. Two separate juries, two separate courtrooms. And against every practical legal consideration available to her, against the advice that any competent legal observer would have offered, she chose to represent herself in both trials. She was not a lawyer. She had no legal training. And yet she stood at the defense table in a Maricopa County courtroom and conducted her own proceedings across two full jury trials. She filed motions. She cross-examined witnesses. She addressed the court. She used every procedural mechanism available to a defendant to remain standing at the podium, present, talking, visible, the subject of every eye in the room. During the Arizona proceedings, she was housed at Estrella Jail in Phoenix under maximum security classification, administrative restrictive housing, which is the formal institutional term for what most people outside corrections simply call solitary confinement. 23 hours a day inside a cell, measuring 11.5 feet by 7.5 feet. White walls, a stainless steel sink and toilet combined into one fixture, a hard, flat mattress, a small desk, one narrow window set too high in the wall to see the ground outside, positioned just low enough to confirm that. Daylight existed somewhere on the other side. 1 hour out per day into a common area, access to phones and a wall-mounted tablet for video visits, and then back inside. Consider what that environment means for someone who had spent years making certain she was never out of view. Before her arrest, Lori Vallow Daybell had positioned herself at the center of attention at every available opportunity. She had sought national media coverage, given jailhouse interviews, made courtroom appearances that functioned as performances. She had filed legal motions not purely as strategy, but as a mechanism for remaining present in the proceedings. She had cross-examined witnesses and addressed judges and used every platform available to her to stay visible, to stay the subject of the conversation, to stay in the room. In that cell in Estrella Jail, there was no room. There was no conversation. There was no platform. There was a stainless steel fixture, a sliver of light through a narrow window, and the sound of her own voice if she chose to use it. She remained in that classification for the full duration of the Arizona legal proceedings. In April 2025, the first Arizona jury returned its verdict on the charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the death of Charles Vallow. Guilty. In June 2025, the second Arizona jury deliberated for approximately 20 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on the charge of conspiracy to commit attempted first-degree murder in the case of Brandon Boudreaux. 20 minutes. After years of investigation, multiple states, thousands of pages of legal record, and 2 full jury trials she had chosen to conduct herself, the second jury needed 20 minutes. If you are finding this coverage valuable, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Crimes Records. The research and production time that makes coverage at this level possible depends entirely on this community. Now stay with this, because the most important part of this story is still ahead. On July 2005, 2025, Lori Vallow Daybell walked into a Maricopa County Superior Court courtroom in Phoenix, Arizona, wearing an orange jail uniform. The trials were finished. The verdicts had been recorded. This was the last time a courtroom would be required to address her directly. There would be no more proceedings after this one. No more opportunities to stand before a lens. No more motions to file. No more witnesses to question. No more rooms full of people watching her every move. This was the conclusion of her legal journey. And what happened inside that room over the course of those proceedings was unlike anything that had come before it. The families of the victims were seated in the jury box, the exact seats where jurors had sat during her trials. Someone had brought tissues. They were passed down the row before a single word had been spoken. Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandfather, appeared by remote link. He did not arrive composed. He had not prepared himself to be composed. He looked into the camera, and he told her directly, with his voice raised and his words entirely unfiltered, that she had taken something that could never be restored. He said he would never speak her name again. He called her nothing. And then he asked her a question. He asked it more than once. He asked it knowing with complete certainty that she would not answer. "Did you enjoy it?" She did not answer. Kay Woodcock followed her husband. She called Lori a liar, a fraud, and a person responsible for the deaths of multiple people. Then she did something that brought the entire room to a different kind of silence. She read a letter written from JJ's perspective, the voice of a child who had never reached 13. The letter said, "I should be 13 years old now, but I am forever 7. When Kay reached the final line, she did not read it quietly. She directed it across that courtroom with every ounce of what she had carried since the day she learned what happened to her grandson. "I trusted you." Then she broke down completely. Jerry Vallow, the brother of Charles Vallow, stood and delivered what he had come to say in a single sentence. "She wrote her own disgusting make-believe story," he said, "and she wrote it in blood." Brandon Boudreau, the man who had survived a bullet through his vehicle window in October 2019, stood at the podium with a voice that was visibly unsteady. He told the court he had made a decision about how to carry what had happened to him. He said he chose to forgive her. Not for her sake, for his own. Then came Colby Ryan, Lori's only surviving child, appearing by remote link. He described the day he was told Charles Vallow had died of what he initially believed was a heart attack. He arrived at his mother's home and discovered the truth, that his stepfather had been shot, that the man he had grown distant from in the years before because Lori had told him Charles was being unfaithful, had done nothing wrong at all. The unfaithfulness had been hers. The separation between Colby and his stepfather had been engineered, constructed deliberately to make what came next easier to carry out. He described watching his family come apart around him. His siblings gone. His stepfather gone. The life he had known before any of this began. Gone. He described the years that followed. The fight, he said, to simply stay alive through the weight of it. And then he addressed his mother directly, and what he said brought the room to a silence that carried more weight than anything else spoken that day. "I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy, not the losses, not the legal proceedings, not the investigations across 2 states. The person, the woman who made every choice that produced every outcome. 11 words from her only surviving child. When Lori's turn came, she used her time to criticize the justice system. She argued that she had not received a fair process. She claimed the rules of evidence had prevented her side from being heard. Judge Justin Barresi stopped her mid-sentence and corrected her on the official record. "The rules of evidence," he said, "allow both sides to present their case. She had chosen not to testify. She had chosen not to call a single witness across either trial. Those were her decisions, made freely, and they were documented." Then she offered the only acknowledgement the court would ever receive from her. "If I was accountable for these crimes," she said, "I would acknowledge it, and I would let you know how sorry I was. Not I am accountable. Not I was accountable. If." A conditional tense, chosen deliberately, from a woman convicted by 2 separate juries in 2 separate states, who had just sat in a courtroom while a grandmother screamed through her tears, and a grandfather said he would never speak her name again. And a grown man's voice broke as he described years of living in the shadow of what she had set in motion. The word she chose was if, and it was not a mistake. Before taking her seat, she told the court that she believed a divine force was assembling a group of people inside prison systems around the world, people who would ultimately be released to carry out a higher purpose, and that she counted herself among them. Judge Barresi addressed that directly. He told her the scriptural passage she was drawing from was about people of faith passing from this life into peace in the afterlife. It was not, he said, about people walking out of corrections facilities. Then he looked at her and said, "It will take an act of God for you to go free. In short, you should never be released from prison." He had taken her own belief system, the scripture she had built her identity around, the divine purpose she had assigned to herself, and he had redirected it with a single sentence to mean precisely the opposite of what she had intended. He had used her own theological framework to close the door on her, but he was not finished. Judge Justin Barresi had served as a Maricopa County Superior Court judge since 2017. In that time, he had presided over serious criminal proceedings. He had evaluated defendants who had planned carefully and acted without remorse. He had seen the full range of what deliberate human cruelty looked like when it was brought before a court of law. When he reviewed the complete record of what Lori Vallow Daybell had done, the years it covered, the states it crossed, the number of people drawn into it, the sustained and meticulous planning required to hold it all together, he made a statement that carried the full accumulated weight of his years on the bench. The amount of contemplation, calculation, planning, and manipulation that went into these crimes, he said, is unparalleled in my career. Unparalleled in his career. He was not saying it was the most physically violent thing he had seen. He was saying it was the most deliberately constructed. A framework built over years, across state lines, using personal relationships and financial calculation and religious belief as instruments. A system that required other people to be drawn in and used as tools of its objectives, including her own children. He had encountered nothing like it in all his years on the bench. Then, he turned to the sentence itself. 2 consecutive terms of 25 years to life, ordered one after the other and stacked directly on top of the entire Idaho sentencing block. On paper, Arizona law includes a parole threshold after 25 years. In practice, that threshold does not exist for Lori Vallow Daybell. To reach it, she would first have to complete 3 consecutive fixed Idaho life sentences that carry no parole mechanism whatsoever. Sentences that by legal definition do not end. The Arizona clock never starts, because the Idaho block never concludes. 7 life sentences, 2 states, no exit, no board, no review date, no hearing penciled in anywhere on the calendar of her future. And then Judge Barresi said the thing that this entire story has been building toward. He had watched her throughout the Arizona proceedings. He had watched her represent herself across 2 full conspiracy trials. He had watched her scan every room she entered before settling into her seat. He had watched her file procedural motions with no realistic chance of legal success that kept her name active and visible inside the proceedings. He had watched her conduct cross-examinations that produced nothing of legal value while keeping her standing at the podium, present, talking, seen. He had watched her use the formal time the court extended to her, time reserved for legal argument, to deliver statements that functioned as public commentary on her own situation. He understood precisely what he had been watching. She was not simply building a legal defense. Every motion, every question, every statement pointed in the same direction. Remaining at the center, remaining the subject of the room, remaining visible. And then he told her what was going to happen to all of that. Eventually, he said, the camera that you seek out, the media requests, will lessen over time, and you will fade into obscurity. That was the statement. That was what this entire documentary was building toward. Not a legal punishment, not a number of years. A fact. A prediction grounded in the straightforward nature of public attention and how time moves, delivered by a judge who had watched her seek cameras for months, said directly to her face, placed on the official record as the final substantive thing he would ever say to her in a professional capacity. For most people, obscurity carries no weight as a threat. It is simply the ordinary condition of a life lived outside the public eye. Most people do not seek cameras. Most people do not build their sense of identity around being watched and recognized and positioned at the center of every room they enter. Lori Vallow Daybell is not most people. Her entire operating framework, the belief system, the self-constructed identity, the daily behavior across years, the legal strategy she deployed in 2 Arizona courtrooms, was organized around a single constant: being seen, being central, being the figure that everything else in the room oriented around. A theology that had no category for insignificance. A worldview in which the final chapter of human history converged on a single point of consequence with her at the center of it. The judge told her she would fade from that. And then she was returned to Idaho. The Pocatello Women's Correctional Center sits on a hill in southeastern Idaho. It holds approximately 355 women drawn from every security level, minimum through maximum, all housed under one roof. It is the largest women's correctional facility in the state of Idaho. The daily routine follows standard corrections protocol. Morning count. Meals at scheduled intervals. Work assignments covering cleaning, kitchen operations, and sewing. Recreation period. Evening count. Lights out. The schedule does not vary based on the nature of a woman's sentence. It does not separate the women who will eventually return to the outside world from the women who will not. The programming runs regardless. It was running before Lori Vallow Daybell arrived. It will be running after she is gone. One specific detail is worth noting in the direct context of this case. Among those 355 women is Robin Rowe, the only woman in the state of Idaho currently sentenced to death. Lori Vallow Daybell is housed in the same facility as the one person whose legal sentence most closely mirrors the structure surrounding her husband. Chad Daybell is on death row at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. His appeal is active. His case is moving through a process that has a direction, a legal framework, and an eventual endpoint the state has formally committed to reaching. The state of Idaho is engaged with Chad Daybell specifically because it has an obligation to carry out what it imposed. There are hearings, appeals, judicial reviews at multiple levels, and people within corrections and legal systems whose specific professional responsibilities are tied to managing a sentence the state is obligated to execute. Lori Vallow Daybell's sentence carries none of that structure. The state's obligation to her is not to carry out a conclusion. It is maintenance. The state is not working toward any outcome for her. It is simply holding a position. And it will hold that position, day after day and year after year, until she dies inside that facility. Research on long-term confinement consistently points toward one finding. When a person has a release date, even one that is decades away, they can build their psychological existence around it. They can count time against it. They can hold on to the idea that something ahead of them is different from today. The sentence has direction. It is moving towards something. Lori Vallow Daybell has no date, no direction. The only arc available inside her sentence is a daily correction schedule that will look exactly the same in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, until the day she passes away inside that facility and the schedule continues without her. There are no cameras inside that facility pointed specifically at her. There are no journalists waiting in corridors. There is no upcoming proceeding that requires her presence before a lens or an audience. She is no longer a defendant. She is no longer filing legal motions or questioning witnesses or warning judges about divine purposes or positioning herself at the center of a room full of people who have been required by law to direct their attention toward her. She is an inmate number on a facility count of approximately 355 women. The institution's only obligation is to confirm twice daily that she is present. The woman who spent years placing herself at the center of every room she entered, who operated from a framework in which she was a figure of cosmic significance directing events that mattered on a scale beyond ordinary life, is now on a work rotation in a facility that has no record of that framework. There are 354 other women inside those walls, each with their own histories, their own sentences, their own reasons for arriving in southeastern Idaho. The institution holds all of them the same way. It does not know her belief system. It does not acknowledge her self-assigned significance. It does not care. What is happening inside her sentence, quietly, daily, without ceremony, is a specific kind of removal, not physical. Something more precise than that. The steady institutional daily confirmation that the world does not revolve around her. That the narrative she constructed, the one in which she was the central figure, the author, the person nothing could happen without, is finished. Not because it was argued down in a courtroom, because it has been replaced, without acknowledgement, by a corrections schedule in southeastern Idaho that has no record it ever existed. She told people she was preparing the world for events of final consequence, events that would involve everything converging on a single point of significance. The Pocatello Women's Correctional Center is not that point. It is southeastern Idaho, a facility count of 355, a work rotation that does not know her name, and a schedule that was running before she arrived and will keep running long after she is gone. In April 2026, her attorneys formally filed an appeal with the Idaho Supreme Court. The filing challenges her convictions on the basis of legal errors and constitutional violations. including the argument that key decisions regarding her legal representation were made, while questions about her mental competency were still formally unresolved. The Idaho Supreme Court has accepted the case for review. Idaho prosecutors have responded in full, submitting a brief that addresses and rejects each of the 5 constitutional claims raised in the appeal. Their position is that the trial court handled every issue properly and that her convictions should stand exactly as they were delivered. That process will take months, possibly years. When significant decisions are issued, coverage of this case will briefly return to the surface. Then it will settle again. Chad Daybell remains on death row. His name will remain in circulation for as long as the death penalty appeals process continues to move through the courts. When that process reaches its conclusion, whenever the legal machinery finally arrives at the endpoint the state announced on June 1, 2024, it will generate sustained and significant coverage. His case is still in motion. There is still a direction. Lori Vallow Daybell will have the appeal, and then the retrospectives on significant dates, and then the archive. The judge said it on July 2005, 2025, in open court, directly to her face, on the official record. And the record already supports him. The process is already unfolding in the direction he predicted. The coverage that was constant during the trial years has begun to thin. The appearances in national headlines have grown less frequent. The courtroom performances that kept her at the center of the conversation are over. There will be no more proceedings in either state that require her presence before a camera. The last courtroom has already happened. What remains is the facility, the schedule, the count, and time. Consider what that means for someone whose entire sense of self was constructed around an audience. Her belief system required other people to receive what she said, to exist within the narrative she was writing, to be positioned within the framework she had built with herself at the top of it. That system required an audience at all times. Without an audience, the framework has no function. Without people to receive the narrative simply stops. Not because it was defeated. Not because it was proven wrong in a way that carries any satisfaction for her. Simply because the room emptied and the schedule continued, and no one inside that facility is required to acknowledge that the framework ever existed. A death sentence has a defined structure, a beginning, a middle, a named conclusion. The state is actively working to reach. The person inside it is still in motion, still moving through a process that has a direction. There is still a legal relationship between the state and the individual, still an active obligation, still a named endpoint somewhere on the timeline that everyone involved is oriented toward. A sentence without an ending has none of that. It begins. It continues. It does not conclude in any direction the state is moving toward. It ends only when the person inside it passes away inside that facility. But the state is not working toward that. There is no process advancing. There is no conclusion being constructed. There is the facility and the daily count, and the 354 other women and time. And living inside that sentence, a woman who spent years building a cosmology in which she was not simply another person, but the person, the one at the center of the final chapter, the figure without whom the conclusion could not arrive. The Pocatello Women's Correctional Center does not know that chapter. It does not acknowledge that figure. It simply runs its schedule and counts its residents and makes no distinction between the women who believe themselves significant and the women who did not. The most precise summary of this entire case, everything it cost, everyone it touched, every decision that set it in motion, every life that was ended or permanently altered by what Lori Vallow Daybell chose to do, did not come from a prosecutor. It did not come from a judge. It came from the one person in that Phoenix courtroom who had no choice but to keep living when everything was over. Colby Ryan, her only surviving child. 11 words. I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy. Not the losses, not the years of legal proceedings across 2 states, not the investigations, the forensic evidence, the buried remains, the exhumed body, the collected benefits for a child who was already gone. Not the verdict forms read aloud in 2 different courtrooms. Not the sentencing hearings or the victim impact statements or the judge who said her name would fade from public memory. Not any of the documented, terrible, factual record of what this case produced. The person, the woman who made every decision, The woman who chose the path that produced every outcome this story has covered from beginning to end. 11 words from her only surviving child. And nothing said in any courtroom, in any state, across any proceeding in this entire case came closer to the complete truth than that. J.J. Vallow was 7 years old. He was forever 7. Tylee Ryan was 16. She was last seen alive on a September afternoon at Yellowstone, visible in photographs, present in video footage, and then gone. Tammy Daybell lived an ordinary life beside a man she trusted. Charles Vallow knew something was wrong and tried to document it and ran out of time. Brandon Boudreaux survived and chose to carry it forward, rather than be consumed by it. Colby Ryan is still here, still speaking, still finding the 11 words that say everything. And Lori Vallow Daybell is in southeastern Idaho, on a hill, in a facility that holds 355 women, counted twice a day, on a schedule that was running before she arrived, and will keep running long after she is gone, in a sentence that does not point toward any conclusion, that the state is not actively working to deliver, that simply continues day after day, without ceremony, without an audience, without the camera she spent years seeking, without the room she spent years filling, without the framework she spent years constructing, without the significance she spent years assigning to herself. The judge said it on the record. The record already supports him. If this story gave you the full documented picture of what happened and what it means, share it with someone who has followed this case. Every view, every comment, and every subscriber to Crimes Records is what makes coverage at this level possible. The research behind this story took significant time, and this community is what funds it. Like this video, subscribe to Crimes Records right now, and turn on notifications so you are there when the next story arrives. The next case is already in production. Do not miss it.